Hello and a very warm welcome to a very special podcast series, Mentorship Hour, brought to you by Shiv Nadar Foundation. In this series, we are going to talk about a variety of issues ranging from economic issues to trade-related matters, to technology, to innovation, to entrepreneurship, and employment and social impact issues as well. For this episode, I am delighted to have Sachin Aggarwal, an Indian Trade Services Officer, to talk on the broader issues of trade, as well as how trade can serve as an economic multiplier and as also a major engine for global growth. Welcome to the show, Sachin. Delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Sachin, let's first talk about trade as an economic multiplier. And we know how trade can serve as a major engine for global growth. In the context of India, however, over the last several years, we have seen that India's exports have significantly grown, not just in terms of volume and value, but also in terms of destination and diversification. So if previously we are exporting to a certain number of countries, we are probably exporting to more countries now, and the diversity of goods and merchandise exports particularly have increased significantly. In the context of the Indian industrial landscape, particularly the broader economic landscape, it kind of has benefited the Indian micro, small and medium enterprises the most, because there's no gainsaying the fact the importance of Indian MSMEs in India's economic landscape. There are about 110 million MSMEs in India, employing about 60 million people and accounting for about 45% of India's GDP. Help me understand this. How is trade helping Indian MSMEs grow?
So if we see the contribution of the MSME, they contribute almost to the 50% of our mercantile exports. The MSMEs, if we see the manufacturing MSMEs, some of the MSMEs have acquired the economies of the scale and they have become the part of the global value chains. And if we see the MSMEs, mostly they are in the labor intensive sector, and if we consider our labor intensive sector, it consists of leather, gems and jewelry, the textile sector. All these sector, given that India is also signing various free trade agreements, and the free trade agreements come with the natural duty cuts. So these MSME are able to tap those markets,
right.
And even the government have helped in this regard. Our exports to the USA or the European Union, not only just the developed markets, but also the emerging economies.
That's right.
Like Latin and Caribbean American countries have also grown significantly.
It's good that you talk about the significance of trade pacts. And over the last few years, we have seen a spurt of bilateral and also multilateral trade pacts, particularly in the broader sense, because it's not just limited to FTAs now. We also have what we call as comprehensive economic partnership agreements, or sometimes comprehensive economic cooperation agreements. The most recent one, of course, being with the UAE. One of the purposes, or rather the objectives of inking this kind of CEPAs or FTAs or SECAs, as the case might be, is to integrate the Indian economy to global supply chains. And you briefly touched upon that in your initial response. If you look back now, say over the last 7 to 10 years, do you think Indian MSMEs are getting increasingly integrated to global supply chains through their product exports?
Definitely, Indian MSMEs are going to be integrated into the global value chains, particularly if we see our free trade agreements. We are signing the free trade agreements with the Australia, we have signed the free trade agreement with the UAE, we are in talk with the UK and as well as European Union. Besides, we are also focusing on the trade talks with the Peru and the African countries as well. So I think the Indian MSME is going 8 to 10 years down the line, given that our labor intensive sector in which MSMEs are primarily engaged are definitely going to get significantly in the terms of gaining the market access to these countries.
The other thing is about the Mode 4 of the Services Agreement of the WTO, which will probably form the part of the Indo-UK FTA. If the FTA is in place very soon, sooner rather than later, can Indian professionals look for easier visa rules?
Definitely, Indian constitute a large part of the UK populations, and they contribute significantly to the 6% of the UK's GDP. Now, if we see in terms of movement of professionals, the present Rishi Sunak government has tried to cut down the number of professionals from 7,45,000 to 2,50,000. They've also enhanced certain visa application fee and the processing fee. So, but I think given that UK also recognize the significance of the Indian diaspora contribution in the UK, so I think Indian professionals, those will be allowed to, like India forms a significant part of supporting the national health services. So I think definitely Indian professionals will gain definitely access in the UK market.
The other question that I wanted to ask you about on trade itself, on global trade, and is also on the importance and the influence that the dollar wields. If you look at UAE, for instance, India has struck a deal with the UAE. Progressively, probably anything that we import from the UAE is progressively going to be done in rupees. So the payments are going to be done in rupees. We are also striking separate deals. Other countries. I'll give you an example. India, about only 15% of India's imports are probably not dollarized. That is, the payments are not made in dollars. Everything that we import, out of our total imports, only 5% comes from the US. But about 85 to 90% of all our imports are paid in dollars. China, we have a huge trade relation with China. Particularly, we are a very big importer of Chinese goods. But most of the payment is done in dollars. Are we looking at an increasing de-dollarization, and how is it going to help?
See, RBI has already taken steps in that regard. There was a circular released by RBI back in the 2022, and we have established the rupee trade mechanism through opening of the withdrew accounts. So, one of the major challenges in the opening of the withdrew accounts is the trade deficit that we have with the countries. Particularly with the Russia, we try to implement the rupee trade mechanism. But since we import a huge amount of commodities from Russia and we export very few, so there has been the rupee surplus in the Russia, and the exporters are unsure that what they will do with this rupee. But I think coming forward, we are able to somehow convince the Russians that they try to invest back into our economy with the help of rupee, or they try to invest in our government securities. So that way we could basically help this mechanism work out. We should also try to explore the rupee trade mechanism with the UAE, we should, in the France also, with various Southeast Asian countries. So I think in the coming forward, we would see the de-dollarization of the economy, but we have to improve our trade balance in that regard. That only we could somehow make this mechanism work.
And one of our biggest importers, and why we have a trade deficit also, it shows up in the current account deficit every quarter when the RBI puts out the numbers, is also because of the imports that they do on oil. 75 to 80% of our crude oil requirements are imported, and that's met through various sources. We import our oil from Russia to the Gulf, to Latin America. Now with the UAE, we have struck a deal. We have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and now we are increasingly moving towards a rupee-denominated trade relationship. What about the Gulf Cooperation Council, considering the GCC countries? There are about 10 countries there, from Bahrain to Kuwait, to Oman, to Qatar, to Saudi Arabia, and also the UAE form part of the GCC. I understand there is an ongoing negotiation going on for an FTA or a CEPA with the GCC. How far are we from getting it there?
With respect to Gulf Cooperation Council, we have good trade relation with them because we are the largest importer of the crude oil and the natural gas. Our imports from the GCC were around $133 billion, and now our exports are very less, around $50 billion. So in the coming times, we also have a large diaspora that is present there. And since we primarily export the commodities like refined oil as well as the precious and the semi-precious stones, in the coming month, we have already started a talk of GCC FTA. So if we are able to ink the deal with the FTA, GCC countries, we would definitely gain in terms of our labor intensive sectors, as well as that would be a great contribution to our diaspora as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned the diaspora, because if you look at the total remittances, the NRI remittances to India, it's about $80 billion now. It has been growing progressively. I think the NRI remittances are the highest in India. We have just overtaken China so far. Remittances.
It is around 100 billion.
Yeah.
It is just.
Yeah. So, and 50%, about half of that come from the GCC countries, the broader GCC, the Gulf countries, as we say. We also we have some kind of civilizational ties with the Gulf countries, and we have seen how the Prime Minister Narendra Modi himself has expended a considerable degree of time and also his own interest in making visits and also tying up strategic interests there. Once the FTA is, if there are any challenges in the FTA negotiations, what are these, and how do you think we can overcome this with the GCC countries?
One of the main issue with the GCC countries, since they import a crude oil, there is a issue of Asian premium, that they export the crude oil to us at a higher price than what they do with the Western countries. So definitely eliminating that Asian premium is one of the most important tasks. Then we also have to look for our market access with respect to professionals. Since we have seen in the Gulf country, there have been the policy of indigenization with respect to the Nitakat law of Saudi Arabia, and we have Omanization. We have the policy in UAE where they are trying to restrict the movement of professionals. And definitely it are going to impact our remittances inflow into the countries. And besides that, how we are trying to navigate the issue of environment as well. Like the issue regarding the fossil fuel extractions. Now these comes with the environmental complications. How we are going to navigate those challenges, whether our trade deal would be able to promote a sustainable future or not. And definitely with the push toward the renewable energy, how we are going to navigate that thing with the fossil fuel dependent economies in the GCC. So that will be the major challenges. Besides, we also have to ensure that our duty cuts are basically sufficient on various items.
And how confident are you that we'll be able to ride through these challenges?
The Gulf Cooperation, our trade talks with the GCC started way back in 2006, then 2008, and we have deferred the talks and now they are being held again. So I think, and the government is very committed towards signing the FTA. So I think it would be signed within 1 or 2 years. It would not take much time.
And I'd also like to know your views about an existing FTA that came about after extensive confabulations and negotiations between the government of India, our trade negotiators, and there, which is the Indo-ASEAN FDA. That came about 15 years ago. There was a different government in place, but the trade negotiations with FTA ASEAN countries was very long drawn. And I remember those days I was covering the Commerce Ministry, and we used to get briefed on where the sticking points are. We were told that time, and there were expectations that and there were concerns from both sides, of course, and there were concerns from India's domestic side also that it's going to result in some kind of unemployment, and also some micro, small, and medium enterprises domestically could get affected. Looking back now, if you can count out the benefits first of the Indo-ASEAN FTA, what would these be? And second, where do you think we have probably got a short change and got affected?
Particularly if we see the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, there have been the significant jump in the trade with respect to the ASEAN countries. But however, the major issue with the ASEAN countries have been the increase in the trade deficit. That is almost sort of around 300%. If we compare figure for pre-FTA, that was 2007-9 to 2021-23. There is almost a 300% increase in the trade deficit. Second major issue is the China. The China have been able to build a significant trade relation with the ASEAN countries. If we see, and they have been the significant manufacturing giant which have emerged in the ASEAN countries. If we take the example of Vietnam, or if we take the example of Thailand, these countries have emerged a manufacturing giant, and they are now basically competing with India in terms of various developed countries' markets. Now Vietnam, if we see the China plus one strategy, now most of the investments are not coming into the India but going to the Vietnam, because it has a good business conducive ecosystem. So that has been the major challenge. But going ahead with the signing of the free trade agreement, it has not only resulted into the trade dividend, but also in terms of boosting our strategic ties with the Asian countries. We have the Delhi Declaration. We are regularly holding the talks with the Asian countries. We are also now conducting the review of the Asian trade in the goods agreement. So I think with the coming time, we would be able to definitely gain more from the Asian Free Trade Agreement. We also have to focus more on the sector where we enjoy complementarity, where we have the natural advantage, and that could and we could displace the China in those regards.
There is also this partnership that is coming about. It's a multilateral partnership, and which is essentially called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and it's got to do with various things. It's not a free trade agreement because it spans all the continents. India is a part of that. We saw in last year in 2023 around May, I think, where the ministerial there was a conclusion of a ministerial where a global supply chain and integrating, which gave an opportunity for India to actually integrate India's MSMEs into global supply chain more effectively. If you look at IPEF as a body, what is the kind of influence it's going to have? Because it's not a free trade agreement in the conventional sense. There is no agreement, there is no contract, but countries, individual countries, are part of this bloc, negotiating and negotiating a supply chain agreement of sorts without actually saying so. So how do you situate IPF in the context of multilateral FTAs that India might have or the world might have, and also the bilateral CEPAs that India is signing?
As you pointed out that we don't have like duty cuts, or we don't have any like trade pet, the IPF is not that kind. IPF is more about the non-trade issues if we see the supply chain resilience initiative. So it try to focus on making our supply chain more robust and diversifying our import sources or export markets. And second is, it is about, there have been the plans regarding the digital economy, there have been the plans regarding the fair, clean economy with respect to the environment. So it is about tackling the various non-trade issues and focusing on the market access and making our supply chains more robust. It is not about duty cuts, but in the context of the free trade agreements, I think by taking certain steps in that regard, by focusing on the various non-trade issues, we would be definitely preparing ourselves for signing various free trade agreements in the future. Because trade agreements are no longer more about the duty cuts, it is more about the non-trade issues, if we see with the UK or the European Union.
Yeah, so, and final question is on the RCEP. Which India actually did not go about and sign it and did not become a part of it because there was a concern, and it was threatening to trigger into a big domestic political issue. It was an election time of a different period, and there was specifically concern that cheese and dairy products from New Zealand, particularly New Zealand, Australia, is going to flood Indian markets, actually affecting Indian dairy farmers and processed food, dairy processed food entrepreneurs. How true is that fear?
That was essentially a true fear, because if we see in the RCEP, particularly when the Narendra Modi ji government withdrew from the RCEP, they cited Gandhi's talisman. So at that time, the main concern of the government was that it would affect our small farmers, or it would affect our people engaged in dairy and the fishery sector. Now there was a threat of the cheap imports from the dairy products from the Australia and the New Zealand. Second was the biggest concern from the China. Already we have a huge trade deficit with the China. And by signing of the free trade agreement, it would have resulted into the ballooning of the trade deficit. And besides, it would have also dealt a huge blow to our micro, small and medium enterprise. Then there were various other issues in the RCEP, particularly with regard to the tariff reduction, or with respect to intellectual property rights, or with respect to the investor-state dispute resolution mechanism that would have subjected India to the complex regulatory arbitration mechanism outside India. So all these issues combinedly put forward that basically give the realization to the Indian government that we can't afford at this juncture to eliminate our micro, small and medium enterprise or our domestic sector. But I think there can be no dispute on the argument that we have to integrate into the global value chain somehow or the later. Even the Niti Aayog CEO, I heard at that time, he was also expressing concern that India's decision to withdraw from the RCEP was not good, because we are trying to withdraw ourselves from the global value chains. If we see Vietnam's success story, or China or any other country, they have been built on the global value chains. It is not that they are manufacturing all the products. A special part of product is basically being manufactured in the country. So we could have generated employment, we could have generated the exports, we could have achieved significant in terms of our consumers. But I think India should definitely in the coming time would review the RCEP agreement, going into the RCEP.
So do you think in RCEP the problem is less of New Zealand and Australia and more of China because of strategic interests?
Yes, it is more because of China, because we have almost around $100 billion of trade deficit with the China. And if we allow the duty-free imports, then definitely it would have gone to something around $150 or $200 billion as well.
And finally, last year we had the very successful hosting of the G20 here in India. We also had the Delhi Declaration. How do you situate the Delhi Declaration so far as India's trade relations are concerned?
As far as India trade relation is concerned, if we see the G20 countries, all of them are developed countries and majorly of them are emerging market economies. If we are able to situate ourselves in the G20, it will definitely help boost our market access in various countries. Besides, G20 also holds a significance in terms of our strategic interest, in terms of serving the strategic interest. If we talk about various sectors like gems and jewelry, the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals, the automobiles. So all these sectors definitely want a greater market access in various other countries where we already have a very high duty on the Indian products as well. So I think in the coming times, and there was a talk about the supply chain resilience initiative. There was a talk about how to make the WTO more strong, in order to make the liberal trade order more strong, because this is a phase of deglobalization that is going on. So I think India would be definitely be able to emerge successful in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think G20 has kind of raised the bar and also set the expectations high for expanding the area possible so far as trade relations across the world is concerned, not particularly limited only to the G20 member nations. Thank you, Sachin. Thank you for taking the time out and dropping by to have this conversation with us and sharing your deep insights and perspectives on a variety of issues, from trade relations to free trade agreements to comprehensive economic partnership agreements, and the benefits that can accrue to millions of Indian micro, small, and medium enterprises through these agreements, trade treaties, and trade relation pacts. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening. You can watch this on youtube.com and get to listen this on any of the streaming platforms through which you get your podcast from spotify.com to Google Podcast to Apple Podcast to Geo7 to Ghana to earshot.in and other streaming apps that you might be using for listening to podcasts. Mentorship Hour brought to you by Shiv Nadar Foundation. Mentorship Hour will be back again with a fresh new episode with another expert on another topic.